welcome to SNS and to today's seminar on anti-money laundering. My name is Louise and I'm a research director here at SNS, and it's a pleasure to guide you through this session today. I also lead our research project Crime and Society here at SNS, where this seminar is a part. And as always at SNS, we're very fortunate to have a lot of expertise in the room. We hope for a lively discussion with your thoughts and questions. So if you would like to ask a question, please start preparing them already now, and I will bring you in during the conversation. Now, it's my great pleasure to welcome Tom Kirchmaier, Professor and Director of the Policing and Crime Research Group at the London School of Economics. Tom, the floor is yours, and you have 15 minutes for your presentation.
Good. That's hard, you know. So I'm Tom. They call me the local criminal at LSE. So we are economists. So we come on from a rather unique angle, I would say, because we only do data, but hopefully we do it rather well. So this is a topic that really interests me. Some probably think is really weird. But economic crime, organized crime, because it's a really big thing. And what I have to tell you is I don't know much. I know more than others, but overall as society globally, we actually don't know very much. We are really at the very beginning of this journey. And so it's great to be here. And just shoot me with questions. I'm an academic, I'm used to it. So I'm not scared. So a little kind of recap about where does the money actually come from and how big is it actually. And so I always say there are four very different types of sources of funds. And the first one is what we really care about, which is organized crime, serious crime, very big harm. Politicians care about it. Drugs is about 50%. Then you have human slavery, child sexual exploitation, these pictures, racketeering, fraud, cybercrime, and so on. So this is one area we really care about. Then the other one, which probably kind of Danske Bank was taken, to the cleaners with it, was kind of this embezzlement of state funds, tax evasion, serious corruption. The case there was Russia. Probably the Russian Secret Service was involved, and there was state involvement in how this actually kind of came. Very big amounts, we know very little. Normally the regulator looks the other way because actually it does no harm locally, and it rather pops up the banking system because it's very profitable and so on. The third part that doesn't really affect us that much here in this part of the world is avoidance of currency controls, which is a very big issue in Asia. There is a very nice story from an academic point of view about Saipan. Saipan is a little island in the Pacific where the Americans sent bombers to Japan in 1945. And that kind of was then forgotten until recently, until Chinese entrepreneurs started to build these big casinos and laundered billions and billions through it. And how did we find out? Not because our controls were so good, but because a lot of Chinese laborers died by building these casinos. And one day, the Department of Labor in Washington said, why are there so many people dying in Saipan? And then somebody went there and this all kind of came up. And the last point is terror finance, which is essentially a knee-jerk reaction of what happened after 9/11 by the Americans. I don't think it should actually be done by the banks because we have not the right tools for it. It's very small amounts of money. And we probably need to push back now and push it back to the police and do some arrangement there. So how big is the problem? And now we don't know. So we normally go and estimate it top down. We say, so what's roughly the GDP that is affected? So the UN roughly says it's about 3%. You get everything from 1 to 5. There are actually sources out of Sweden who say it's 8, but let's assume it's 3, which is kind of well market settled. So global GDP in 22 was about 100 trillion. So the number is about $3 trillion every year. So it's a real amount. It's really serious. And it's every year. So, we was 3 trillion, now next year another 3 trillion and another 3 trillion. So it's really, really big. It's global. and it works like water. It goes for the weakest link, exploits it, moves to the next. And it's relentless. And this 3% is only the first part here. Oh, it's the first part here. It's just this serious crime, the OCGs. So the other part comes on top. So you can actually talk easily about $5–6 trillion, which we need to wash every year. So it's not small. I think that's the starting point. And $1 trillion is actually quite a bit of money. So when you look at London, and I'm an economist, so everything is about prices. And so when you go to London, so you have a big pot of money, not something small, you have a couple of 100 million, and you want to wash them, you pay about 6% at the moment. So now you deduct the bribes you have to pay and the profits you take out, so the detection likelihood is about 0. So organized criminals don't fear to be detected, which is the other thing. So we have a lot of money and we have a very efficient system on the other side. What you have on the demand side, I'm an economist, as I said, the OCGs that need this money to be washed, they operate perfectly global. I just said they're like multinationals. Really well organized, very good advisors. They have a lot of money to buy themselves the best legal advice, whatever advice. And they use it very cleverly. And we learned this in EncroChat, they're incredibly well organized. On the other side is us, who came up with a regulatory framework, which is incredibly manual, I think very ineffective, which you see from the price, because otherwise the price would be much higher. And it's super cumbersome. And probably at the end of the day, we just annoy ourselves. Opening a bank account is now a real headache. And they want to know everything about me. And, I got kind of, when I lived in Denmark, they investigated my account. It's like, what do you get out of a professor? It's like, it's super clear. It's like, who's done money laundering? So, although they picked up a guy in the University of Southern Florida who was laundering money for the Venezuelans, they charged about 10%. So he was well above market price. Good. So, what do we know about them? We know very little. The first thing is, what do you think you know about OCGs you know from Hollywood movies? You laugh, but it's actually really like that. And it's all about the mafia, and it's kind of mama and pizza and whatever. But it's not what you think OCGs are. They're incredibly well organized, incredibly tight. And this is why we don't know anything about them, because they function so well. And the first true insight we got was via EncroChat, which was kind of a malware the French Secret Service managed to put on the server together with the Dutch one, and it was the biggest law enforcement success in Europe since the war, probably ever. And what you saw, so in the UK they arrested about 1,500 people. None of the people who they picked up was actually known to the authorities. And I did some work with this OCG mapping exercise. It was all wrong. And this is kind of something for us to accept, that what we think we know isn't what's happening. So we have to start with a very blank sheet of paper. And so we are doing some project with Blommé. It's a 5-year project and probably another 5 years after that, because we have access to all the EncroChats that kind of came through the courts in Sweden. It's really interesting, but it's really complicated, as you can imagine, because we have millions and millions of these chats. And I always say kind of OCGs are the Achilles heel of policing, because it's real harm, it's real big money, and it really affects the society. And, we also said just here in the beginning, hiring more police officers on the street doesn't really help us anything, because the real threat comes from these OCGs, from cyber attacks, from people fleecing your bank accounts one way or another. It makes the public feel better, and the British, politicians kind of completely fell into this trap. So they had lots of new people without training, but the issue is somewhere completely different. Good. So on the other hand, and this is kind of, the other side of the coin. So we know very little. It's a real big issue, but I think what we do is incredibly ineffectual and incredibly expensive. It's a huge tax on the population. And so we did a bit of back of the envelope calculation with Danske Bank because they disclosed this in the annual report. And then when you actually kind of extrapolate it to the entire country, and it's a really small country, you come about, $285 per household, and the US dollar fell, so it's probably more like $300+ at the moment, or $133 per person in Denmark, every child, adult. This is far too much. We cannot continue and charge the population this amount of money. I think you will disagree with me probably in a second, but that's my view. Good. And how many convictions did the Danish get out of it? 20, of which were 10 for tax evasion. It's not our job to do tax evasion. So you get 10 convictions for $800 million. So each conviction is $80 million. It's insane. You can run a full police force on the back of this. Good, bit of institutional background, and I have to speed up. So where did this all come from? So this was a decision by the G7 in '89. In November '89, the wall came down. The Europeans had completely different problems for the next 20 years. And the Americans and the Brits actually kind of went ahead and kind of started to have a much better system. But then they have this, what they call poison papers, where kind of the Secret Service gives the bank something to say, actually look at Mr. X or Mrs. Y. But what does the bank do? Because it's not allowed to have this information. And so how do you solve this problem? Then it gets interesting. Then 9/11, as I said, then brought us CFT. I think there's something we really have to push back on because this is a job for the police. This is not a job for the banks. Counterterrorism. And then now we have AMLA, which first was to be in Rome, then in Dublin, and now it's in Frankfurt. But I think there's a huge structural problem with AMLA, and we can discuss this later, where we actually don't have a level playing field and we don't get access to the data. We just go after the small countries trying to enforce what's going on. In my opinion, would it be much better to actually upgrade Europol because it's a policing issue and we need to kind of solve this interaction with the police, I think. And my bottom is kind of the summary, banks are the policemen for the politicians without the politicians having to pay for it. So we kind of abuse them a little bit. So way forward, and I have 2 minutes. So so the issue is about we have to work together. And we have to automate the process. And this working together goes well beyond data sharing. And what I proposed for a while and typically got shot down is I said we need to co-locate the financial intelligence unit with police officers, put them on both sides of the table, and then they can go for lunch together. And actually over lunch, we have the interesting discussions about what's going on. Because we need to facilitate much better information exchange on an informal basis. And so, the police has its function because it's, obviously the representative of the state, it's the sovereign. And we have the regulators and the FIUs on the other side, which know something about banking and have access to the people. And if we're really clever, we send somebody who we vet and sit in this room from the banks. That's my view. Then the other one is that we should think until AMLA is running, how do we get Europol into a position that it can have this information exchange? They're doing something, but I think they can do much more. Good. And the other one is then on automation. And I know there was this idea in this country about information sharing amongst banks, which didn't go very far. In 2016, I did a model for the policing regulator on predicting crime in the UK, which works actually really well. And so if you think about a bottom-up model, where people live, you live next to people you like, and so you have very homogeneous groups. So I don't need to know exactly who you are. I just need to know who you live, to know who your characteristics are. The other thing we know from this Blommé project, organized crime is incredibly spatially concentrated. So I probably only have to look at 0.1% of the areas in each country to know where they roughly live. So if I kind of come the other way around, it's like, okay, I know where they live, I know where they operate, why don't I just focus my energies to where I know they live instead of boiling the ocean? You get much further without actually having to know anything. And then I can exchange information without violating any GDPR or anything else on the back of it. So why is this important? Because our models at the moment don't work. So we have no outcome variable. So we can't run a regression or any model. So we call this a left-hand side in academia, something we need to understand. So either I share the left-hand side from the police, or I find this proxy, like I share it via a proxy, this is space, with each other to get actually into a system where it can run machine learning models, regression models, and we'll talk about it in a second. Good, how much time do I have? 1 minute, good. I was asked to do a little bit on AML. So as I said, I did my entire life research on data. And so what people think, AML on AI. Why do I have AI? AML, so on AI. And so AI is just a pure continuation of what we've done over the last 20, 30 years in data. And AI models is nothing else than a super, as a prediction model on steroids. And so they come in three types. The latest ones is LLMs, these large language models, ChatGPT and so on. And if you would have asked me 2 years ago, I would have kind of given you a snooty answer because it didn't work. Now it is really working. And why? Because we throw enormous amounts of money at the problem. Is about $500 million a year. So, and once you throw that amount of money at a problem, the problem starts to move. It's very simple. So then something, object recognition, where we do a lot of work on it too, is kind of, you had this always self-driving cars and it fell to the wayside. And then it all started with machine learning models. A machine learning model is a model that we dismissed in the 50s as being widely inferior. Why? Because we couldn't do any causality. And these regression models were much, much better. And we came back to it because some of the problems we don't need to have causality, but also we have this phenomenal improvement in computing power with these GPUs that suddenly allows us to do stuff we didn't do. So my view on AI is it will not replace anybody. We will be able to solve problems we couldn't solve before. That obviously also means we will need to reshovel employment as such, but I think the total will stay the same. The reshoveling process will be very painful, I think. Good. And so, as I said, it's essentially the same what we have before. These GPUs, to give you an idea, we trained a model on a classical AWS machine. It took 2.5 days. We trained the same model on a fast, not super fast GPU machine at the LSE. It took 10 minutes, same task. So it shows you just the power of what we can do with these NVIDIA chips. But it also shows you why that we suddenly see this revolution, because we have computing power which we didn't have before. Good. And then there's more kind of a philosophical part is, when you clicked on something in your Google screen, you selected, you made the selection. Now the selection is done by a computer. We turned the computer from a selection system into a judgment system. And so every time you have somebody else making a judgment, things get a bit rough. And so we need to think a lot about how we ensure the quality. Hallucinations about 0.8% of the time, which is far too high to run a reliable system on the back of it. Good. And I think where I want to end is nobody knows where the dice will fall in terms of technology. So all we have to do is allow massive experimentation. And for that, and this is kind of almost something we can now discuss about Sweden, we need when it comes to financial crime, a very robust method of sandboxing. Quick testing, checking, and then either we scale it up or we dismiss it. And then we try again, hundreds of times. And it's very much against the institutional structure we have developed about, strict regulation of banks and everybody else. That's for me. All right, Cindy.
Thank you so much, Tom. So you talked about the weakest link, but what is that?
Well, I think there are many, like it came out. So the thing is, we know that we don't know, and I think this is the first one we need to accept. And it's hard for a regulator to say, actually, I write regulation on something I don't fully understand. And so we need to stop people and say, let's rethink this entire process, make it cheaper, faster, better. And from there, build our regulatory system that kind of runs into the new world. And remember, the system we built in the early 90s on technology we had in the 80s. So we are 45 years out, essentially, with our processes, and it's time to renew them.
Okay, and what are the main things that we can learn in Sweden from other countries? You studied this in the UK, for example.
Well, so the first one is obviously the sandboxing, which I really think is something we can solve very easily. And, Sweden has a very thriving financial innovation system, like they have a lot of fintechs, whatever that is. And so you have an environment that allows you to exploit it, but you need a regulatory environment and a legal environment that facilitates this. And it's really not so complicated to do once we get the ear of the politicians.
But that's not allowed in the current system?
So you're much better in Swedish law than me. I'm a foreigner. So, but this is what I also observed there in Denmark. It was just a headache. At the end of the day, we didn't get anywhere. So for full disclosure, I got a grant from Danske Bank at one point to study money laundering. As you know, they had a small problem there.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Tom, please just raise your hand. So you also called for more international harmonization. What reforms or actions would you like to see? Well,
so my thinking comes from the other way around. So the demand is global. You have this globally operating OCGs. And so now you have each country in Europe and in the world doing their own little bits. And that is obviously not working, because, we kind of, I'm sure we try all very hard, but it all fizzles out because we don't coordinate against a very well-organized counterparty. And so this is kind of what we need to do. Now, AMLA was kind of an idea to go into that direction. As you heard from me, I'm very critical about it. I think there would have been better ways to do it, but here we go. It was the French and the Dutch who kind of pushed this, nothing against them, but so this is where this came from. And it was more dirigist and less market-driven. So this is the one thing, and to the other, you need to have an information exchange that goes across border without violating the privacy if you want to actually succeed.
And AMLA can't solve any of this?
No, at the moment, so the way I understand it, it's not designed to solve this problem in this way.
Okay, yeah, we will talk more about that in the panel discussion. Yeah, see if everyone agrees on that. Okay, so and what would be the main consequences if we don't tackle money laundering?
Well, so we stay in the status quo, which I think is not very good. You have these organized crime groups causing a lot of harm, and we pay a lot as a society to do nothing against it, essentially. And so, this is the two parts. We need to bring the costs down, and we need to become much more effective. And now we obviously have this huge wave of drugs rolling across Europe for the last few years. So, we do have a bit of an acute problem to do something about it.
And you talked about the police in the UK. Is more policing or more efforts into AML?
No, so you heard it. I was very critical. It's kind of political knee-jerk reaction. We have a problem, therefore let's get more police officers. but then we get them to walk the street, but that's not really where the problem is. The problem is, we have very well organized people on the other side causing a lot of harm, which we don't observe. Now, if you see a Bobby on the street, and I don't know, a police officer on the street here, it's great, you feel safe, but it doesn't solve anything because it's only petty crime you pick up at the end of the day. I know the public likes it, but, maybe we need to educate the public that they should look somewhere else.
So more resources into email, but still less because it was so inefficient? Or?
No, I think, this is the point. I think we need to stop, think, and come up with a new system that automates, that does a lot of the heavy lifting by a machine, and then we use our resources to really tackle and address the people we're really interested in. At the moment, we're just picking up, I know this case from Denmark better, we're picking up, the mama and papa shop who didn't pay his taxes. That's not the issue we are interested in.
So we're not catching the big fish.
Correct. And you see it in the market price. If the market price should be whatever, 35%, not 6-7% for the big fish. And this is kind of where we need to start thinking about it.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you so much, Tom. And do we have any question? Yeah.
Ilinka Benson from SNS. In order to become more successful, is it basically working more efficiently, or is it do we need to change regulation in order to be able to work more efficiently?
I think all of the above. So we need to change the regulation. As I said, the regulation is really old. It's 45 years old. It also was designed for a time when we really didn't have the computing power, the technology, and so on. And so you need a regulatory framework that allows the machine to work. And at the moment, we don't have it. And we are weak on the regulation side, but we're also weak on the machines, on the algorithm side.
Yeah, okay, good. One question there, and one in the middle, and one over there.
Thank you, Mr. Kirchmaier. I was intrigued by what you said about having an extremely efficient OCG society, finding opportunities in different jurisdictions and different mechanisms, and the thing about us needing to exchange information. It's one thing to exchange information within the government, for example, or the police requesting information from banks and so on. But do you think that there's an interest from the banks to actually exchange information with each other and the police concerning their customers and transactions? What's your take on that?
So, in theory, they should be very interested, for two reasons. A, because they have a mandate to do so, but also it costs them a lot of money. Like I had this number here, which I didn't dwell on, is about 15, some people say 20% of the employment in a bank is all about, AML and compliance. And it probably should be 5% of it. So if I'm a banker, if I'm the CEO of a bank and somebody tells me I can save 10% of my workforce, I'm interested in it. So I would say, no? Yeah. 100%. Good. The other thing is obviously the only way for the machine to work is to have a bigger pool of data. And I need to go into a little bit of a technical thing. It's like you need to estimate the model bottom up, from the people up. At the moment, we do something which you do in asset pricing. You look at past prices to predict the future. Now, even in the tube in London, you have this thing is like the past is not a predictor for the future. So the models don't work. So you need to go back, get a picture of the population of your transaction to estimate where are the issues, but also what's the pattern. So it's two different algorithms. And you can only get there by having some form of information exchange. And even if the banks are not interested, which I think they would, the regulator and the politician should have a huge interest to enable this, because it makes the society much safer, and we get rid of these OCGs who cause us all this harm. If that answers your question.
Okay, thank you. One last question here before we move on.
So what model or example of governance would you advocate? Is it Australia with a very active regulator? Is it Singapore with big data and analysis? Or is it the Netherlands with public-private partnership? Or something else?
You have a very British accent, but you're not British, no? So, none of the above. So, and I don't think we should. So each of these models have its advantages. You know, Singapore is very small. You know, and they really push really hard into all this AI stuff. And I go there all the time now. But it's not a model for the world. The Netherlands is really advanced with digital technologies again, but again, they haven't really made the step. And I think I come with a much more basic assumption. Let's just stop and think how we can do this better. There's nobody to look at. We need to, think it from a theoretical point up. We need to build it up what we want. And it's really not so difficult anymore, but we just need to stop and get this pressure out from, politicians. Look what the others are doing. Let's just do it properly once. And here is a great chance for Sweden to push this out into the world. And by no means I'm saying the Brits have it under control, because they don't, actually. So.
Okay, thank you. And you can stay on stage, Tom. Good. And I would like to introduce our next speakers, Erik Blommé, Chief Legal Counsel at the Swedish Financial Supervisor Authority, Finansinspektionen, and Emma Movitz, Head of Economic Crime Prevention at Swedbank. Very welcome, both of you. So do you agree with Tom that things aren't really working?
To some extent, I would definitely agree with Tom. There is a huge problem that we are trying to tackle. But I do think that we are doing much more now than we have done in the past. And I think that we are definitely building a better framework to succeed better in this going forward.
Is AMLA a good example?
AMLA is one of the parts, definitely. AMLA is built around the premise that we need to have a cross-border solution for a cross-border issue, and I think that is a premise that I firmly believe in. It will have direct supervisory powers, indirect supervisory powers, and the structure to create a more harmonized setting for the entire European Union. I think that has a real benefit. But we are right in the middle of implementing AMLA and the whole structure around AMLA, so it's difficult to say right now where we'll be in 5 years.
Okay, it's not really up and running yet.
No.
Okay. And Emma?
Yeah, when it comes to new regulatory bodies, I think from a banking perspective, we just have to operate with what the decision order is. So I don't have any specific opinions actually on that, but rather that we will follow, of course, what is stated. Having that said, I believe that if there's an opportunity to move in a certain direction, any authority out there should pay attention to data sharing and information sharing and how that can be utilized. I couldn't agree more on that point.
Okay. Thank you. And Tom suggested, for example, sharing data and cooperate, but also to share statistically. Is that anything you think would work?
I can start. Yeah. So we have something called, that's very public, Samlit at this point, where the banks are not sharing any information, because we can't, but we share statistics on high level, modus operandis, what's cooking right now, what are we looking into, not specifically why we are doing that, but just that we are. And we can't initiate anything really, but we do have, according to the current regulation, we report SARS, specific suspicious activity reports. And somewhere these are collected, and together with the moduses, we believe that the regulatory forces out there, including the police, has a better ground to stand on. However, that can of course improve.
Erik, can comment.
Sure. I am very much positive to information sharing, both amongst the authorities and also in the public-private partnerships. And if you go back 5 years, we didn't have much of that at all. And if you look where we are now, it has been a tremendous increase of that type of information sharing. Now we have a Swedish regulation allowing for authorities versus private entities to share intelligence on intelligence level, which I think is probably very effective. At least that's my experience. But we also have a setup for the European Union based around both strategic initiatives, both regionally and within the EU, but also through specific AML colleges. And these, you were talking about how we're not being specific enough. I think that this is probably the right tool to be that specific. We have around 450 of them all across the EU right now. The Swedish FSA is involved in around 80 of them. And what we do there is we collect all the supervisors in charge of one financial institution has a permanent representation in each country. And we share risk assessments and we coordinate supervisory measures on that specific entity. And I think that is really groundbreaking in the sense that we haven't seen that type of cooperation structure in the world yet. So I think there's a lot of momentum going perfectly in that direction of increased information sharing.
So there you can share basically intel, everything?
We can share the information that we have. The FIUs can be a part of these structures, but it's not to the same extent as our supervisors. So we need to liaise both nationally, but also within these colleges. They are set up a bit differently depending on which type of financial institution we are talking about. But there is a possibility that we have now that we didn't have before.
Okay, so what are the main challenges left then to share information across countries?
I think cross countries, from a supervisor standpoint or from the authority standpoint, I think that we have quite a good setup. There are changes to be made, of course, but I think the base plate for that type of information sharing is pretty good. Where we are lacking is probably in the sense of sharing information with the industry, with the private sector, both from us authorities, but also amongst industry itself, bank to bank, etc. I think that's probably the next step to explore.
Yeah, because that you can't do today, right?
No, we are prohibited by law currently to share any information between the banks, there are some, like Erik says here, there are some possibilities when authorities asks for information and then on their side sue it together. But it's not sharing for real. And we can't do any preventive measures in the current situation together. We do plenty of preventive measures on each side, but not together based on the current law situation.
And you can't like merge the data and do these machine learning?
Absolutely not.
Yeah, okay.
Would I love to? Absolutely.
Tom, any questions?
No, I think this is where the two worlds come together. You know, it's like I come from let's automate and let's kind of automate across Europe in a way. We don't need so many people. We don't need so many institutions. We don't need so many people who go to these meetings. We have built one big machine, which is technically perfectly possible. So we can do it today. And there's obviously, you know, Erik's idea of we build it up from a national institutional structure. It's also interesting, you know, you have this tension between the FIU and the regulator, which we have in every country of the world, and the FIU being probably the weakest link everywhere. You can disagree or disagree in a second. So, but the point is, we're trying to aim at the same target, but from different directions. I come global, automated, and it comes more from national systems, which we build up into a more integrated way. And obviously that we don't have the banks fully involved is a problem, because they are the actors. You know, they are the people who run the show every day. And then we obviously have fintech on top, which is an extra issue. You can challenge me.
Well, I think that's interesting, but I think the way we view how we all sort of have the same goal here is that we view all of these parts as part of an ecosystem. We have different roles, and the FIU has in part to supply the law enforcement agencies with intelligence so that they can go about their business and arresting criminals, but they also supply us on the administrative side, on the preventive side, on what we need to pick up on in order to have the proper countermeasures in place before they actually can commit these crimes. So we have a little different perspective on how it all comes together, but when it works like it's supposed to, it really is an ecosystem where we hopefully get better each year.
Okay, now we talked a lot about data sharing. Is that where we should focus our efforts on, or is there any other measure?
I think the sky's the limit in terms of what type of initiatives we can have to further this work. Information sharing, technological innovation are definitely at the forefront of what we need to further develop. But also, coming from having worked in these cooperation structures, I think that they are very much key, even with having this data, even with having this technological innovation in place. I think you still need to have this institutional, because we will have institutions going forward as well, to really get to know each other and to know what mandates, what possibilities, what limitations, what structures we are all operating under, so that we make sure that when we do share information, it really hits home and it really gets an effect.
Emma?
To build on what Erik says, if you think about it from a helicopter perspective, it's not like the criminals, the big gangs, the 3 billion people out there who are laundering money, and it's a society issue. I think you showed that pretty well, yeah. So it's not like they're having this conversation. Or maybe, do you do it or should I? Or should we just fall between? I don't know. That's not the conversation that drives these people. The price is low because the system is efficient. There's trust in the system, there's skills in the system. So why can't we, on the white legal side, do the same? I really think that is something that we need to push together. And from an institutional banking perspective, we are really up for doing more together. But we will always follow the law. And the current compliance rules are there for a reason, and we follow these. But at the same time, we really want to push to see that we can use data in the way that we want, in the way that actually makes a difference for a broader setting. Mm-hmm. To your previous point, it's not so that it's the people that we think that are the criminals out there. It's everyone who you don't think. So we can't predict in that way anymore. We need to predict in a different way. So to reset the system, maybe as a part of regulatory development, to keep compliance, because it's very important to have a sort of foundation, but to allow for flexibility on top of that. I think that's the key from a banking perspective.
And I think I came in the same way with my sandbox idea. Well, it's not really my idea, it's kind of the argument. We need to allow experimentation. And we don't know what the solution will look like today. Nobody knows. So we need to just give people the chance to try. And so why is the Valley better than we are here? It's because they just try it out. Very simple. You can discuss the benefits of Silicon Valley and so on, but they get this quite right. The technological progress comes from the West Coast.
So we can't predict today. So our predictions are there. They're not.
Let me put it like this. Everything that Tom here talked about is true. We see it every day. Every day. EncroChat came about. Not that we know the information in the banks, because we don't, but when we get questions, we need to answer on them, because we keep the regulation. and it's absolutely true. There are things that come up that we would never have found without these things, because it's not the regular pattern. And that's why it's so hard to predict with old models, and hard to predict with only catching data points that people give you. You need more.
Now, from an empirical point of view, you can't predict. That's what we would say theoretically. with the data stream you have, you can't predict these things. And you don't, so it's...
Okay, do we have any questions from the audience? Yes, one over here.
Thank you so much for a kind presentation. I like all that I'm here. My name is Jörgen. I work at the Swedish National Defense University. So we're looking into Russians and their performance when it comes to money laundering. We're taking great pleasure at seeing UK being so good at taking care of all the Russians there at the time. When I listen to you, I lack one thing regarding a target-centric approach of what do we really want to achieve by all these measures. I like your presentation, Tom, regarding money, but still the banks are not into handling police cases or court issues. They're there to prevent some issues as well. And of course that will cost money, and in order maybe to being giving the appointment of doing it. What I think needs to be done in a certain way, which you all three can elaborate on, I think large organizations, meaning authorities in Sweden and large banks, are not that tremendously good at buying new computer stuff. And once they get an order and get it in, it's already old. I think what I see it from the military intelligence in Sweden, they're stuck with really old things. So people coming in want to work with it, feel that I don't want to work here because the stuff is so old that I would like to see something else and work with the newest parts. Mm-hmm. I think a private organization being let in to authorities, but also banks, and given the authority to prove things in a sandbox would be a clever way of trying to adopt things, because that kind of understanding of the new stuff is not necessarily inside the authorities or the large banks. And that opens the door for private cooperation doing the analysis with already existing data, being allowed that, because within the organization, I don't feel that neither the police or the banks are forward-leaning or wanting to address an issue. They don't know what kind of issue they would like to address. The banks are banks and the police are police, and it's hard to find the mixture point in between. I don't mean that they are not good, they are very good, but solving the organized crime issue handles a target-centric approach in this issue, and you need to address it by other thoughts than being raised today. Just trying to annoy everybody, but that's what I see.
Well, can I just add, why don't we let some academics in too, and not just companies? So, you know, we do think ahead a little bit, hopefully, of the firms. And I think we shouldn't put any restrictions on it. Everybody who has a good idea should try it out. And, you know, my idea is as good as yours. And so it just allow people to experiment. You know, obviously within kind of safeguards and so on. We have this huge vetting procedure in the UK, which may or may not work. But, you know, you have to have some safeguards. You can't let everybody on this. But, you know, within reason, there shouldn't be any limitation.
I will continue. Otherwise, do banks have the right incentives today to fight money laundering effectively?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. There's more incentives than needed, I was about to say. And especially now when we have some sort of collaboration, not for data, but on at least talking to each other at least, that we see that the information out there on how crime is organized, as an example, and how many people that are involved on different levels, and see that it's not 100 anymore. It's not the Napoleon Mafia. They're only like 50. Yeah. No. So it's not like that anymore at all. It's tens of thousands involved, and to understand that and see that. Just when I started in this, it was fraud, and then it was anti-money laundering, and they did not talk to each other because they were different businesses. We made sure, at least in my bank, that we really get the ecosystem together and see that often it's fraud on one hand, and the other hand is money laundering, and they work on the other side very well together. So we also need to do that. And I think the next step is to make our authorities and regulators to understand how they can facilitate also an enforcement of this.
Okay, so fraud and anti-money laundering together. What do you say, Erik?
I think that makes perfect sense to connect those dots. And I know that when you're trying to tackle fraud, you use a lot of the framework that you have from the anti-money laundering with transaction monitoring, etc. So they are connected, even though they're not specifically connected in regulation, but they do have definite synergies. And
what is needed in regulation to connect those?
Well, I think that Emma probably better in seeing what she would like to see in terms of change. From my perspective, you can definitely work against money laundering and fraud within the regulation that you have today. There's not necessarily a gap there that prevents you from doing so. I think, like I started with on this point, a lot of the framework that you use for fraud detection actually comes from the money laundering framework and the systems that you use for that. So they are interconnected today. At least that's my view. I don't know if you agree, Emma.
Yes, of course they are, because we have to. Otherwise, it would be crazy. But the regulatory frameworks are different for the both, and sometimes they clash as well, and that could be reviewed, in my humble opinion. Fraud is much more tied to payments and the payment regulation in PSR and PSD and those kind of regulations. Why AML has its AML frameworks. That I think can be strengthened. And while waiting for that to be strengthened, we are doing what we can in the back end. And at least we can't share information with other banks, but within the bank we can. So we are working with that, of course.
Good that you're a big bank then.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So Erik,
maybe I can come in here a little bit because it's an interesting point. You know, Sweden is obviously a reasonably small country, like 12 million people. We have 380 million in Europe now, 8 billion in the world, and so each one, even just if you look across the Nordics, they run their own ship and they have their own rule book and their own institutional framework. And then you have the Nordic banks who run one rule book across different jurisdictions. You can see where that ends. And so, why can't we just write a common rule book, at least in the Nordics? That would be really pretty helpful. I know it pushes the authorities a little bit. But we face a global problem and we come with our quite nice, good initiatives, but they're extremely local. So you have very local against very global, and where do you end up?
It's more international harmonization.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And let's start with the Nordics alone, and then you do something in Europe and so on. Europe is always a complicated entity. I love Europe, don't get me wrong. It's like,
So, Erik, you mentioned before that risk-based approach is the way to go. So can you expand on that? And why is it so important? And what can you actually do that today with the limitation of the data and the...
Well, the limitation on data, I think, is separate from the risk-based approach in principle. It's part of adopting a proper risk-based approach. You need good data. But what the risk-based approach that we have from the FATF standards all the way through the anti-money laundering directives and into our national legislation is a regulation that in my view is very risk-based. It does allow for the specific businesses to analyze what risks are relevant for them, for their specific operations, and to address those risks through preventive measures. So I think that it would be very possible to have a much more detailed regulation, but then I think you would lose that element of having a risk-based nature, which I think is very much key to having an effective AML system.
And we will move on a little bit to wrap this up. So each one of you, if you could pick one or two reforms to cut financial crime in Sweden, what would that be?
Well, as a regulator, I think I'm supposed to be something on the regulatory side, but I think we have our hands full. We have the EU AML package being implemented right now, and in 2 years we will have a totally different setup than what we have today. So I'm not sure I'm willing to add anything to that list because I'm not sure how that would play out in 2 years. But not all reforms need to be of a regulatory nature. I think that what we have been discussing here today with technological innovation and data sharing, I think that's probably the reform that I want to see more of, in using that innovation to strengthen our collective efforts against money laundering. I think that's the reform that I'm most hoping for.
Okay, Emma?
For one thing, there is a new authority out there called Finansiellt Underrättelsecentrum, FINUC. Sorry for that. And had a different abbreviation first, they changed that. I think that's a really good statement from the authorities that has happened. From a Swedbank perspective, we are super supportive to that initiative, without saying anything on what we will be doing there, but it's a very important initiative. If that could be combined somehow with the things we talked about here, with a general understanding of how banks specifically can share data that also the authorities can have access to, and the regulators, I think that would mean real business for change in this type of industry.
Okay.
Well, my line is a very simple one. We need to automate. We need to allow technology to emerge, because we shouldn't do it with humans. A machine should do the heavy lifting.
Do you think we can ever be ahead of the criminals?
Oh, you're never ahead of the criminals. The question is, how far behind are you?
Okay. And okay, great. Thank you so much, Erik, Emma, and Tom. We have to end with that. And thanks also to all of you in the audience for your great questions and reflections. There are coffee and more conversations right outside. But before you go, we want to make some have some information. Yeah, the applications for the SNS Vision for next year are now open. It's a program for young, socially engaged talents in SNS member organizations, and the program runs for 1 year and includes 6 meetings. Each meeting mixes lectures, discussions, and networking with leading figures from business, politicians, and academia. So you can read more about this and apply on our website. And please also take a second to fill out the evaluation for this seminar. So thanks again, and we hope to see you back at SNS soon.